In the last days of 1779, British naval vessels began appearing off the coast of South Carolina, marking the beginning of the Great Southern Campaign of the American Revolution. The British had taken Savannah in 1778, and they successfully defended it in 1779, but otherwise there had been little action on the southern front for several years. British North American Commander Sir Henry Clinton was now determined to completely restore the Carolinas and Georgia to the Crown. By late March 1780, Charleston was under siege, and on May 12th, Clinton accepted the surrender of the city, along with nearly all of the American army in the Southern Theater. Clinton then returned to New York, leaving command in the South to Charles Lord Cornwallis. Although American resistance continued, Cornwallis quickly expanded the British presence over most of South Carolina. In August, a reconstituted American Southern Army entered South Carolina from the north. Cornwallis essentially destroyed that American army in the Battle of Camden on August 16, 1780. This was truly the nadir of the American cause in the South. Over the next several months, to maintain and expand British control, Cornwallis fortified several towns in the interior, including Augusta, 96, and Camden, as well as Georgetown and Wilmington on the coast. In addition to these major fortifications, the British established a number of smaller outposts that would protect their lines of supply between the coast and the interior garrisons. At the same time, small bands of American partisans continued their armed resistance against the British. By December 1780, a third Southern Army was reconstituted to oppose the British. Commanded by General Nathaniel Greene, the Continentals and local partisan forces faced off with the British troops in a series of battles and skirmishes across the Carolinas. In March 1781, the Continentals and British fought a major engagement at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, North Carolina. Although Cornwallis won the battle, he ultimately marched his field army to Wilmington and then to Virginia. Greene marched his army back into South Carolina. There, his most immediate opponent was Francis Lord Rawdon, who had succeeded Cornwallis as the British field commander in South Carolina. Rawdon's primary base in the interior was Camden. The British had transformed the town into a heavily fortified logistical center. On April 25th, Rawdon repulsed an attack on Camden by Greene in the Battle of Hobkirk's Hill. Although defeated, the Continental Army did not retreat, and Greene continued to threaten Camden. All of the British Army's garrisons in the interior of South Carolina were at risk of attack. When Greene returned to South Carolina, he assigned General Francis Marion and Lieutenant Colonel Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee to begin reducing the smaller British outposts. Marion commanded a force of South Carolina militia and partisans, while Lee had his own legion, which included Continental Dragoons and light infantry. Their first victim was Fort Watson on the Santee, which fell to American siege operations on April 23rd. On May 6th, Marion and Lee, along with a single Continental 6-pounder field piece, turned their attention to Fort Motte, on the south side of the Congaree River about 30 miles below present-day Columbia. Fort Motte served as a depot for British convoys traveling from Charleston to Camden in 96. The fort consisted of the newly built Rebecca Mott Plantation House, surrounded by a strong earthwork redoubt. Rebecca Mott may have been the wealthiest woman in South Carolina at the time, having inherited large fortunes and extensive plantation holdings from both her brother and her husband. She was an ardent patriot, but the British allowed Rebecca and her family entourage to remain in the house after it was fortified. Deeming the fort too strong to take by direct assault, Marion and Lee set about the process of a formal siege. Marion's 150 partisans and Lee's 248 Continentals faced 184 defenders in Fort Motte. The British post included regular British infantry, German infantry, and Loyalist militia. While Francis Marion's riflemen kept the British under cover, Lee's men and a contingent of plantation slaves dug a formal siege approach from the north. After 6 days of excavation, the American siege works were within storming range of Fort Motte. The British refused to surrender, and the Americans believed that Lord Rawdon was on his way from Camden with a relief force. With a bloody frontal attack seemingly indicated, Lee and Marion decided to try burning Fort Motte with fire arrows. There are several versions of the story, the most dramatic of which has Mrs. Mott offering a souvenir African bow and arrows with which to burn her own house. In any case, the roof of the Mott house was indeed set afire, and British efforts to fight the fire were discouraged by Marion's riflemen and by the American 6-pounder firing canister at the roof. After the fire forced the British to surrender, soldiers extinguished the fire and saved the house. Prior to our initial archaeological investigations, the landscape of the Fort Motte battlefield was very poorly understood. The site of the fort itself was traditional, and that location was marked by a granite monument erected by the Daughters of the American Revolution in 1909. The only 18th century images of Fort Motte are these drawings prepared by an American engineer after its capture. Aside from some ambiguous mentions in the participant accounts of the siege, we had no other information regarding the layout of the battlefield and its various features. These woodcuts show the battlefield in 1849. The house shown is located on the site of the 18th century Mott home, but it is unclear whether this is the original house, much altered, or if an entirely new structure replaced the Mott home at some point. This woodcut shows the battery mound where the Continentals located their 6-pounder field piece. Archaeologists from the South Carolina Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology originally investigated the Fort Motte battlefield in 2004 and 2005 with a grant from the American Battlefield Protection Program of the National Park Service. Since 2012, we have conducted 4 spring field seasons of 2 or 3 weeks each in an effort to improve our understanding of the site. Our initial work confirmed, defined, and sampled the ditch of Fort Motte, which was indeed located at the traditional site. Our profile showed that the ditch was backfilled from the interior side where the parapet was located. Our initial work also located one chimney base from the Mott house in the interior of the fort. The opposing chimney was located in 2013. During the initial project, we began a program of intensive metal detector coverage of the battlefield. Metal detector coverage has continued intermittently from 2004 until the present, and the results comprise the single most valuable category of data that we have so far. This map shows the various areas that have received 100% metal detector coverage since 2004. The focus of this work has been on locating and defining various features of the battlefield landscape. These 3 hills comprise the scene of action in 1781. To the west and north is the Congaree River and Congaree Swamp. The red arrow indicates Fort Motte on the crest of the center hill. Prior to our archaeological research, other siege-related features on these landforms were known only from the historical record. These include the American siege works, the American 6-pounder battery, the older farmhouse that figures in accounts of the siege, and the campsites of the various military units involved. Our metal detecting data from the immediate vicinity of Fort Motte is comprised largely of fired rifle balls and musket balls. The rifle balls are typically about .54 caliber and exhibit diagnostic rifling and patch marks. The musket balls are about 69/100ths of an inch in diameter and were for the British 75 caliber smoothbore musket. Some of the 75 caliber balls were actually fired from a smaller caliber musket, apparently in an effort to improve accuracy by creating a very tight fit. This map shows the distribution of fired rifle balls in the 100% coverage area around Fort Motte. Generally speaking, this is the incoming fire directed at the fort by Francis Marion's riflemen. And this map shows the distribution of both fired and unfired 75 caliber musket balls. Clearly, the fired balls represent the outgoing fire from Fort Motte, and it is concentrated to the north-northeast of the fort. It was fairly clear to us that we were looking at the British fire from Fort Motte that focused on the approaching American sap, or siege works, although we had not yet located those works. This view is to the south, toward Fort Motte, in the direction of the American approach. In 2013, we began the search for the American works with a pair of hand-dug trenches placed east-west across the north-south axis of the British musket ball concentration. This effort was completely defeated by the sun, which baked the subsoil to a ceramic consistency and made it impossible to read the soil colors. We tried a bigger shovel, courtesy of the landowner, and very quickly intercepted the sap feature in 6 locations. Most archaeological features are easier to see than this. Here there are only slight differences between the backfilled soil in the American trench and the surrounding subsoil matrix, which has never been disturbed. In 2014, we excavated a 10-foot run of the sap where it neared Fort Motte. This trench is the same 2013 track hoe trench in the earlier slide, with the 1781 sap trench excavated. We found no artifacts in the sap beyond a couple of wrought nails. This was a surprise, as even the limited track hoe trench cleaning in 2013 yielded a musket ball and a fragment of a brass shoe buckle. The excavation did reveal that the sap was very neatly dug and maintained, well beyond what might be expected in a combat situation. While the enslaved people who did most of the work were under fire from Fort Motte, and doubtless under duress from behind, they managed to dig a very nice trench. We were also able to see that the sap weathered only briefly before it was deliberately backfilled. The present depth of the sap is about 3 feet below surface, but we believe that there has been some deflation of the plow zone since 1781, and we speculate that the trench may have been as much as 4 feet in depth. Added to this, of course, was the parapet of soil that was continually thrown up facing the enemy as the sap advanced. And this is the profile cut where work ended in 2015. Here you see the backfilled soil fairly well, and it was clearly thrown in from the Fort Motte side, where the Americans would have piled up a defensive parapet as their work advanced. Based on our 2013 test trenches, we had a fair idea of where the American siege works ran, but a detailed plan of the works would have required years of excavation. Fortunately, there is now a way to view such features in the ground without excavation. Ground-penetrating radar uses radio wave pulses to detect differences in soil at various depths. Here is the initial result showing the ditch or dry moat of the fort. Bear in mind that nothing is visible there today except the monument. It's a plowed field. The radar is showing us something that is entirely buried. Later we did a more comprehensive survey, including the area north of Fort Motte where we knew the American siege approach was located. Here again is that distribution of British musket balls, with an obvious association with the American works as revealed by the radar survey. As we have seen, when Marion and Lee moved against Fort Motte, they were reinforced by a Continental Army 6-pounder gun and crew, on loan from Nathaniel Greene's Southern Army. Marion's men built an elevated earthwork battery for the gun to the east of Fort Motte, and fire from the gun was decisive in forcing the British to surrender. This is the engraving showing the battery as it appeared in 1849. When the roof of the Motte house was set ablaze, the Americans directed canister fire from the 6-pounder toward the roof, and the defenders were unable to fight the fire. Surrender or incineration were their only options, and they chose the former. We recovered these canister balls from Fort Motte. The earthwork battery stood until about 1984, when it was graded down in the course of a pine clear-cutting operation. During the first Fort Motte project, we made an effort to locate the battery site, but very dense vegetation made both metal detecting and observation of the ground nearly impossible. Fortunately, the battery is visible on at least 2 early air photos. That allowed our mapping specialist to project its coordinates, and in 2013, she hung flagging tape at the location. When we began work in the spring of 2014, we found the woods freshly cleared of all vegetation other than mature trees. Visibility was excellent, and we immediately saw the flagging tape marking a low but distinct mound about 60 feet in diameter. The most remarkable metal detector recovery was a 6-pound solid-shot cannonball found on the crest of the battery remnant. Here is a sample of materials found in the battery metal detecting block, including the 6-pounder shot, wrought nails and spikes that may derive from the timber gun platform, impacted British musket balls that were probably fired from Fort Motte, and unfired lead shot. We also investigated the battery site with a 1 by 30 meter profile trench. The trench revealed that the elevated mound consisted of redeposited subsoil resting on an old flat ground surface that did not exhibit a plow zone. This was clearly a remnant of the battery mound fill, the remainder of which had been graded away, mostly downslope to the east. Another outlying component of the Fort Motte battlefield was the earlier domestic site on the Motte property, a structure variously described as the old farmhouse or the house of Mrs. Motte's overseer. Mrs. Motte and her family entourage moved to the older house when the siege began. The John Cook map of 1773 shows the name Lloyd at the location of the house. What Henry Lee called the old farmhouse was almost certainly the former Lloyd house, dating to the mid-18th century. The house was located here, north of the fort. Work on this site included systematic metal detecting, surface collection, and several 1 by 1 meter test units. The resulting collection revealed that the house was indeed old in 1781. The ceramic assemblage in particular was more consistent with the mean occupation date falling toward the middle of the 18th century. The British, German, and Loyalist garrison of Fort Motte must have camped somewhere nearby. We believe the interior of the fortification was much too small to accommodate the entire contingent, and in any case it would have been considered much healthier to occupy an open tent camp. Our original metal detecting in the immediate vicinity of the fort produced ample evidence for the siege, but no convincing evidence for such a camp. Since 2012, we have found evidence for 2 discrete 18th century military camps, both at considerable distance from Fort Motte. The westernmost of the 2 camps was thoroughly examined in 2013, with ambiguous results. That site was characterized by a broad, thin scatter of mostly unfired musket balls, rifle balls, and buckshot, together with a few other 18th century objects, including civilian buttons. Not a single uniform button or other diagnostic military artifact was recovered. The mix of ammunition would have been appropriate for the Loyalist militia, but it would fit equally well with Francis Marion's command. We also found a small scatter of Federal Civil War material left behind by 2 companies of the 55th Massachusetts Infantry, who had occupation duty at Fort Motte in the summer of 1865. In 2014, we turned our attention to the 2nd camp, the one closer to Fort Motte. If the 2013 camp was Loyalist militia, we reasoned, perhaps the other one would produce evidence for British and/or German regular troops. In 2014, we applied 100% metal detector coverage to the site and managed to chase out its boundaries in all directions. Once again, we recovered and mapped a large and diverse collection of unfired lead shot that would fit well with a militia unit, but not regular British or German troops. Other finds included more civilian buttons of the period, iron pot fragments, an array of iron and brass strap buckles, brass gun parts from an American long rifle and a British cavalry carbine, and the brass foot from a spontoon or a flagstaff. Again, there were no marked military buttons or other diagnostics. In 2015, we discovered a 3rd camp, one with a reasonably clear association. This site was located down the steep slope to the north of the entrance to the American Sap, and almost certainly represents a camp of Lee's men during the siege. The camp was located on a slope that would not normally have been considered acceptable terrain for a camp. Artifacts included a small but dense scatter of unfired small arms ammunition, melted lead, a musket worm, and a few other objects of interest. We found this 1772 George III halfpenny in the sap camp. This is the most remarkable artifact we recovered from the sap camp, perhaps the most remarkable from the entire project. This is a wrought iron arrowhead, apparently made by beating out the shaft of a large wrought nail. This is almost certainly from an arrow prepared for the fire attack that led to the surrender of Fort Motte. While there is no contemporary map of the siege from the 18th century, by integrating the history, the geography, and the archaeological evidence, we now have a reasonable map of the siege of Fort Motte.